The Man with the Umbrella. It was a chilly evening in a small hill station town, where everyone knew everyone. Nestled in the misty mountains, it was a place where nights came early and the air always had a biting coldness to it. A young boy, perhaps 12 or 13, decided to take a stroll before it got too dark. The winding, deserted hilly road beckoned him. He pulled his jacket tighter around him as the clouds began to darken, and soon a light drizzle began to fall. The road was eerily empty, and the only sound he could hear was the gentle patter of rain on the leaves and the occasional rustling of the wind. As the boy walked, he noticed up ahead in the distance an old man walking with a slight limp. The man was holding an umbrella, moving slowly yet steadily, his figure shrouded in a long, tattered coat. The boy, not wanting to be alone, quickened his pace, trying to catch up with the man. But no matter how fast he walked, the old man always seemed to be just out of reach. His legs began to burn from the effort, and he started to feel an unsettling chill crawl up his spine. Something wasn't right. He called out to the man. "Excuse me, sir!" His voice echoed through the mist, but the man didn't turn. He just kept walking, always just far enough that the boy could never quite reach him. The drizzle grew heavier, the evening darker. Panic started to set in. The boy broke into a run, trying desperately to catch up with the old man. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in quick, ragged gasps. But the man seemed to glide further and further away, disappearing into the fog. The boy shouted again, but his voice was swallowed by the cold night air. Suddenly, the piercing sound of a police siren broke the silence behind him. The boy stopped and turned around, startled. A police car pulled up beside him, its headlights cutting through the mist. Two officers stepped out, their faces serious but concerned. One of them spoke. "What are you doing out here alone, son? It's dangerous to be walking on these roads after dark." Relieved, the boy immediately replied, "I'm not alone. There's an old man walking just ahead. I was trying to catch up to him." The officers exchanged glances. One of them frowned. "What old man?" The boy turned, pointing down the path where the old man had been just moments ago. But his heart sank into his stomach as he realized there was no one there. The road was completely empty, stretching out the growing darkness. His voice trembled as he stammered. He was right there. I swear he was just ahead of me." The officers shook their heads, one of them gently resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Come on, son. Let's get you home." The boy glanced back once more at the empty road, his mind racing. Where had the old man gone? He had seen him, hadn't he? He couldn't have just vanished in the thin air, but the mist, the darkness, and the strange, oppressive silence told him otherwise. Something about the road seemed wrong now, and a gnawing fear crept into his bones. As the officers drove him home, the boy sat quietly in the back seat, replaying the scene in his head. The old man's hunched figure, the tattered coat, the way he moved but never seemed to get closer. He realized something then. The old man hadn't been walking ahead of him. He had been leading him, pulling him deeper into the misty night. And somehow, the boy knew he had narrowly escaped something far worse than being alone in the dark. Back in his warm home, as the boy lay in bed that night, the sound of rain tapping against his window, he couldn't shake the image of that old man. He didn't know who he was or where he'd come from, but he was certain of one thing. That eerie trail wasn't as empty as it seemed.
The Scarecrow by TopNeighborhood_859. I will never tell my parents how my grandparents really died. They wouldn't believe me if I did. You may not either. About a month ago, I had just gone out of class when I checked my phone. To my surprise, I had a voicemail from my father. Sure, Mom has called me from time to time since I left for college, but when I saw that my father had called me, I knew it had to be bad news. I just didn't know how bad.
Son, we're buying you a plane ticket. You need to fly home tonight. There has been an accident. Call me when you get this.
That's all the voicemail said. I called him and he explained that my grandfather had been killed in an accident with his combine while harvesting the corn, and that the shock of finding him had given my grandmother a heart attack. The flight was nerve-wracking. I have never done well with small spaces, and I couldn't smoke on the flight, which made it even worse. I spent the whole flight fidgeting and walking back and forth to the restroom, even though I didn't need to go. I just needed to move around. My dad was already waiting for me when I landed, which ruined my plan of sneaking a cigarette before he showed. He gave me a hug and helped me load my bag into the car. I decided I needed a cigarette bad enough and lit one up in the parking garage. My dad had never seen me smoke, and I tried to act casually as I could. He raised an eyebrow at me as he closed the trunk. I waited for a lecture or an outburst, but all he did was nod.
That's a nice lighter, he said.
I hadn't realized I was still fidgeting with it. I handed him the vintage trench lighter. Ellen, my girlfriend, bought it for me a few weeks ago. Found it in an antique store in Seattle. He took it in his hand, looked it over approvingly. Then he handed it back.
No smoking in the car. Your mother would never let us hear the end of it, he instructed.
My headache was gone now, and I had sufficient amount of nicotine. I threw the cigarette down and stomped it out with my foot. An hour later, we were back at my parents' house. My mother greeted me with a hug, then she stepped back and looked at me up and down.
Your father used to smoke menthols too when he was your age,
she said, and gave me and my father a smirk. I wasn't sure if I was embarrassed that she had caught me or surprised that my dad used to smoke. He gave me a pat on the shoulder and walked into the house. We spent the night catching up on what I had been up to while I was in college. They filled me in on how their business was struggling, but they were keeping their head above water. And then, eventually, my dad filled me in on the details of the funeral. They decided to do a closed casket on both of my grandparents. The injuries that my grandfather had received apparently were too gruesome for an open casket, and they didn't want people asking, so they decided to do the same for my grandmother as well. The next morning, we attended the funeral. There were only a few people. My grandparents were in their 80s after all, and had very few friends that were still around. Afterwards, we went back to my parents' house and ate.
Son, your mom and I have talked about this. We need you to sell your grandparents' farm. We have neither the time or money for the upkeep. If you could take a week off school and clean the place up, get it ready to sell, we will give you 25% of whatever we get when it sells, my father explained.
I took a large bite of chicken and chewed as I thought over it. I could call the school and explain the situation, and I could easily catch up later. Yeah, I can do that. But what do you mean clean it up? How bad is it? I asked. My father and mother exchanged a worried look before she looked back down at her plate. Just before your grandfather passed, your grandmother called me. She told me that he had been diagnosed with dementia. Between that and their diminished health, I suspected the property is in pretty bad shape. You haven't been out there? I asked. It wasn't more than a couple hours away. I couldn't believe they hadn't been to visit. My mother replied in a defensive tone, We have been working 7 days a week. We had to let out all our employees go. Business is not going too well. I nodded and asked what the plan was.
I will drive you out there. You can stay until Friday and I'll pick you up. That gives you 6 days to get things boxed up. I already ordered the boxes. They will be delivered tomorrow.
The following day, my father drove me up to the old farm. I spent a few weekends there as a kid. The place has always given off a creepy vibe, but it was fun. I could walk through the corn all day and never reach the end. As we pulled in, there was a large scarecrow that stood over the corn at the edge of the field. "When did they get that thing?" I asked. My dad didn't answer. Instead, he looked out the corner of his eye, his face contorted into the look of intense worry. Maybe fear. I couldn't tell. As we passed the scarecrow, I looked back. The wind hit it just right for a second. I could have sworn it turned its head to watch us. About 20 minutes after I had been dropped off, I was still wandering through the house, evaluating the countless knickknacks and pictures, trying to decide what should be kept, sold, or tossed. The phone rang. My heart skipped a beat. It had been so long since I've heard a landline ring, I thought it might be a fire alarm. I answered it.
This is Jim. I'm delivering the boxes you ordered, but my GPS doesn't work out there. Can you give me directions?" the man asked.
"Yeah. Head down Old Country Road about 5 miles. Make a right at the dirt end," I said. I tried to think of a landmark, knowing how vague that was. "You'll see a scarecrow. Make a right at the scarecrow." The man thanked me and hung up. About a half hour later, I was washing the dishes in the sink and cleaning up the kitchen. My grandmother must have set out lunch before the accident because there were 2 plates of food on the table. It was so rotten I couldn't tell what it was anymore. The pungent smell of mold and rotten food was making me gag, so I had to open the kitchen window. I listened to the wind chimes on the porch and found it rather relaxing. I began to wonder how many summer days my grandparents sat out on the porch, sipped sweet tea, and listened to the wind. Over the wind chimes, I heard a scream from the field. I shut off the water and let in closer. I heard the scream again, almost as if someone was howling in pain. I rushed outside and stood at the edge of the corn. My grandfather had waited too long to harvest his crop. The sun had bleached the corn until it was now the color of bone. The stalks waved back and forth in the wind. The dry leaves rustled against each other as they swayed. I heard the noise again and began to walk out into the field toward the noise. "Hello?" I yelled. I passed row after row of the maze, looking left and right in the 8 inches of space between the rows. And then, in the distance, I saw a figure move. I began to run after it. I caught glimpses of the figure every few seconds as the wind allowed. After a while, I lost sight of it. I ran faster and faster, trying to catch up to whoever it was, and then I ran full speed into the scarecrow. The straw filling did little to dull the impact with the wooden post, but when I fell back, I had grabbed my nose. I can feel the palm of my hand immediately filled with warm blood. I sat up and felt dizzy. My head throbbed with each heartbeat of mine. I looked up at the scarecrow. It was probably 7 feet tall and then another 2 feet off the ground. I was dressed in blue overalls and a red flannel. The head was a burlap sack with thick red string stitched into a jagged mouth and black buttons sewn onto it for eyes. Then it was topped with a straw hat stitched on with the same red string used for the mouth. This thing was intimidating to me at 6'2". Those crows must be terrified of it, I thought to myself. I pinched my nose to stop the bleeding and began to look around. I saw this scarecrow when we pulled in. There was no way I made it to the road already. I tried to hop up to see over the corn. I couldn't see anything but more corn all the way to the horizon. And when my feet landed, my head felt like it was going to pop. Thick blood began to flow more quickly from my nose. I pinched my nose and held my head back, facing the sky to slow the bleeding. Out of the corner of my eye, that's when I saw it. The scarecrow had turned to face me. I turned to face the oversized doll and figured that it must have been the wind again. For a second, we made eye contact. The big button eyes seemed to be looking right at me. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was the wind that moved the head. It was just a bag filled with straw. It was the wind that was blowing the stalks that I imagined was a figure running. It had been the wind that was howling as it passed through the leaves. But still, as I stared at it, I knew it was staring back. The hair on my arms began to raise, making my arms tingle. My heart began to quicken, and then the scarecrow abruptly lifted its head back up and stared at the field. I ran as I could in the opposite direction. I stole short glances over my shoulder as I pushed through the corn. All I could see was a path of broken corn stalks behind me. Soon, I heard a rumbling noise ahead of me. A truck. I thought I kept pushing on. My lungs began to burn with the effort. My foot caught in the shallow irrigation ditch and sent me tumbling into the dirt driveway. The driver of the truck locked up his brakes and skid past me, missing me by inches. I laid there in the dust for a moment. The driver got out of his truck. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" he asked. His tone was harsh and angry. I stood up to face him. He was in his mid-40s with a big beard and an even bigger beer belly. "I'm sorry. I lost my footing," I said. I looked back in the field expecting to see a monster coming out at any second. The man followed my gaze into the field and looked back at me. "You high, boy?" he asked seriously. I was. I stopped myself. Telling him as I was being chased by a scarecrow would only reinforce his accusation. "I hit my head pretty hard," I said, placing my hand back on my nose. He nodded and then offered to give me a ride back up to the house. "I would have been here earlier if you knew how to give directions. There was no scarecrow out the road," he said. We pulled up to the house and began unloading the boxes as he came to deliver. "I'll be back Friday to pick them up once they're full. Your dad booked a storage shed on the other side of town. You have about 200 square feet, so keep that in mind as you pack," the man said. He stared into the field. "My daddy has a cornfield in the next county. It didn't do half as well as they did here. Actually, now that I think about it, I drove past this place last year. I remember they had a rough crop last year." "Do you know what they did differently this year?" the driver asked. "No, I'm sorry. I don't have any idea," I answered. He nodded and spit. "Well, take care of yourself. I'll see you on Friday." With that, he left. I went inside and grabbed a clean shirt. I washed the blood off my face and hands in the bathroom and changed. I tried to shake off the incident with the scarecrow. I must be more stressed out with the loss of my grandparents than I realized. I needed a distraction and began to pack up the office downstairs. I was putting papers in the white trash bag when I came across a letter my grandmother had written.
"Son, I need help with your father. The dementia is getting worse. The last 2 days he's been raving like a lunatic. This spring a man came by and offered us a scarecrow as a gift. He said it did wonders for his crop and wanted to pay it forward. Your father told him no at first, thinking the man was a swindler. But he insisted, and he didn't want anything in return. Anyway, your father is now convinced that the scarecrow is the reason we had such a good crop this year. But the scarecrow won't let him harvest it. I have left you several voicemails about this, and you haven't called me back. So I thought I could write you. Please help. I am worried about your father. Mom." I put the letter down and sat in the office chair. I could dismiss my experience with the scarecrow as stress or an overreactive imagination, but my grandfather had having similar worries about the same scarecrow?
What are the odds? I thought to myself. I needed a cigarette and went outside to the porch and lit one. I took a long drag and then exhaled. A cool breeze blew by, bringing the wind chimes to life. I turned around to look at them and see if there was one worth keeping. That's when I saw it. The scarecrow was now just 20 feet in the field. It hung up on its post, staring at me. While I was trying to process this, it fell down. More like hopped down. Immediately the post went up and then disappeared into the field. It can't be alive, I thought to myself. Seconds later, the scarecrow came out of the corn. It began running across the lawn carrying the 10-foot post like a Trojan soldier running with a spear. The scarecrow launched that post. It sailed across the yard and missed me by a foot. It took down the wind chimes and impaled the wall behind me. I turned to run inside, but the post was now blocking my entrance. I hopped the rail on the porch and ran towards the old barn. I could hear the scarecrow running behind me, gaining on me, the straw rustling under the overalls and flannel. Once I was inside the barn, I tried to close the door, but it was stuck open for years of neglect. I grabbed the closest thing I could use as a weapon, a pitchfork. The scarecrow entered the room. Its jagged mouth and buttoned eyes now seemed much more menacing as it marched towards me. I rammed the pitchfork into its chest as hard as I could. It pierced deep into its body easily, but it seemed to have no effect. With its left hand, or burlap mitten really, it grabbed my arm. The thing was impossibly strong. It used the right hand to pull the pitchfork out and then towards me. I struggled uselessly against its grip. I desperately searched my pockets for something I could use as a weapon. I took my lighter out and flipped the top open. The flame almost caught instantly. In seconds, the scarecrow was fully engulfed. It let me go and fled in the field. The field was burned in less than an hour. The fire department said it was overly dry because it wasn't harvested on time. They didn't have any interest in investigating the matter further. My father saw the post stuck on the wall when he picked me up. I knew he recognized it as the scarecrow post because he didn't ask any questions about how it got thrown through the wall or how it burned the field down. I know, on some level, he suspects that the scarecrow killed his parents. I know, on some level, that he is grateful I killed it. But I know we will never discuss it because people would think we're crazy.
Mass serial killer at large. Police have not yet captured the suspect and are searching for them. Most dangerous areas are the nearby forest that links your town. Please close all your windows and lock your doors. I have just gotten back from work. I sat down on the couch and turned on the TV, and this is the first thing I see. Seriously, can't this stuff go any further? I stood up and went to make some coffee. I know this is kind of weird making coffee in the middle of the night, but I have a lot of work to do. When I was in the kitchen, I grabbed my favorite mug and turned on the coffee machine. I was very tired at the time. With every second I felt, I was just going to fall over and fall asleep. I couldn't let that happen. As the coffee machine was doing its thing, I went back to the living room to turn off the TV. As I was walking, my eye caught something, a strange dark figure with a black hoodie and some gloves standing in the middle of the street, its back facing me. I didn't think much of it and went to turn off the TV and to get my coffee. I got my coffee and went up the stairs to my office. I turned the lights on, shut the door, and sat down in my chair. I put the coffee on the desk and started doing my paperwork. As I was writing, I heard someone scream outside. That really knocked me out. I quickly stood up and ran to the nearest window. There was nothing outside, only a car passing by. I pushed the door as fast as possible and ran downstairs. Nothing. Silence. I felt something odd, like I wasn't alone. Someone was watching me. I felt the dread seep over me. I turned around. He was standing there, looking at me. Now seeing him up close and personal was a terrifying experience. He had a large smile on his face, with large eyes and dilating pupils. I looked away for 1 second, and suddenly, he just vanished. My first instinct was to run as fast as possible. I ran upstairs quickly, entered my office, and shut the door and locked it. I hid under the table and called 911. My breathing was getting deeper and deeper. I felt dizzy and terrified. Felt like I could pass out any second. A few minutes have passed, but the police still weren't here. I slowly get up from under the desk. I turn around and go to the office window. I saw him, standing there, in the middle of the street, his gaze piercing me. I unlocked the door and went downstairs, step by step. When I got down, I looked at him through the downstairs window. He was still there. I locked the back door and closed all the windows, hoping that the police would arrive faster. But I felt like something wasn't right. He was right in front of me, outside, but I still felt that something was wrong. I was looking at him, and his smile got even bigger with those blunt little teeth. Suddenly, I felt a sense of dread and breathing on the back of my neck. There were 2 of them.
Bring in the next subject. Steven Tyler wakes up in a dark, poorly lit room. He's naked and strapped down tightly to a cold metal table. He's more afraid now than he's ever been in his entire life. As he looks around the room, his gaze lands on a very tall man standing on the opposite end of the room by a metal desk. He tries to yell at him, but there is silence. His vocal cords have been removed, but not in a crude manner. The cut had the precision of a high-class surgeon. Steven notices that the man is writing something down in a journal. The man then closes the journal and picks up a syringe. The syringe is filled with a thick, dark, chrome-like fluid. The man starts to slowly approach Steven. He's writhing around, trying to break free the shackles he'd been put in. He looks into the dark, beady eyes. "What the fuck are you?" he manages to whisper. "I am salvation given form," it replies. The creature shines a bright light in Steven's face and holds his right arm down. Steven is trying to scream for anyone to listen, but his efforts to save himself are futile. He whispers to no one. The thing injects the viscous liquid into Steven's arm. He blinks and wakes up in a new room. On the door, he reads, "2 more Gnest. Testing room 2. He says aloud. Steven is taken aback by his voice's sudden reappearance. He starts testing his voice by saying the names of things he sees around the room. Chair, bed, camera? Suddenly, the door hisses, then opens slowly. Steven waits in anticipation for the door to open completely. Another man, thing, walks in slowly, wielding what Steven could only describe as a futuristic water gun. The creature points the water gun at Steven and opens fire. Steven's head shatters and flies all over the room. Steven thinks he's dead, but he's still thinking. His head slowly rebuilds itself. It's a miracle, but something's off. He looks into the large mirror on his left. His face has contorted into an amalgamation of flesh and ooze. His eyes can't open properly. He can't move his jaw. All he can do is scream because of the excruciating pain he's enduring. He falls onto his knees and breaks down into tears. His tears flow down his face like jagged rivers of salt going between canyons of flesh. The third man walks into the room now. He picks Stephen up and starts dragging him into this dark, rusty metal hallway. Stephen wants to die, but he can't. He cries more, now even more scared than before. The thing stops, drops Stephen onto the floor, and opens a hatch leading into a chute in the side of the wall. From the chute, people scream in agony, "Kill me! Kill me!" The man drops Stephen into the chute. After falling for what felt like forever, he lands, shattering every bone in his body, tearing every ligament, exploding every organ. His body melts into the mountain of flesh he landed on. He shares the pain of hundreds of thousands of people. They all have the same wish: to die. The thing walks into the room with the table. "Bring in the next subject," said the scientist. The other man leaves the room. The scientist opens up the journal again and flips to a new page. He writes, "Subject number 129367. The end." "Mom? Hello?" It's raining cats and dogs outside, and John forgot his umbrella at home. He's had a rough day at school, and he can't wait to get home. His mother's making her famous beet soup. She made that ever since he was a child. His house comes out of the fog and into view. He dashes towards it, sprinting as fast as he can. Halfway there, he stops and takes a breath, then continues. Makes it to the porch. He's so glad to be out of the rain. The door is unlocked. John doesn't notice, and he walks in, dropping his bag off on the floor beside him. He walks into the dining room with the long, dark corridor directly in front of him. The lights are off and the soup is on the table. It's cold. "Mom? Hello?" he asked into the corridor. His mother walks out of the corridor looking very ill. She's almost as pale as the foam dripping from her mouth. "Mom, are you okay? Don't kill me, please." His mother's voice sounded distorted, like a recording. He couldn't see his mother's eyes. He could see eyes, but they weren't hers. John didn't have a clue in the world as to what in the hell this thing was, but he did know one thing. His mother was dead. "Don't kill me, please," it repeated. John swiftly reached for his bag and threw it at the imposter. It hit the thing in the face. His mother's face peeled off the thing's head, revealing a blood-soaked monstrosity with multiple rows of jagged teeth. This creature leapt from across the room, pushing John to the ground. It rolled him over on his stomach and began to create an incision along his spine with its one long abnormal claw. John was surprisingly numb physically, but he was mentally scarred. The thing peeled off his skin. He managed to roll over onto his back only to look up at himself. "Mom? Hello?" the thing asked. The end.